At its height, Wisconsin had about 460 different breweries. So every town had multiple breweries.
And nowhere was there more in one town than in Milwaukee, where at one time 26 breweries were in operation.
Move up to Schlitz, the beer that made Milwaukee famous.
Brew City was once home to some of the nation's biggest breweries, and at one time had the distinction of producing more beer than any city in the world. Global competition changed that, but Milwaukee served as the beer capital in a state where beer making had become a signature industry.
This is as much a part of our history and heritage as logging, mining, cheese making, agriculture. These breweries helped build the state of Wisconsin and individual communities within the state.
Case in point, Chippewa Falls.
We have so many different styles of beer, but there is a monthly production plan.
Jake Leinenkugel is the 5th generation of his family to run their brewery in northwest Wisconsin.
Every brewer that started here, along with my great-great-grandfather, most all of them came from Germany during the Great Immigration in the 1840s to 1870s.
But they arrived to find settlers, Puritans from the East, already here, and they did not share their thirst for brew. There was a very strong anti-drinking culture in Wisconsin in the mid and late 1800s. Some towns, like Delavan, were even created as alcohol-free colonies. One of Wisconsin's first dry or temperance bars is still there.
There were a lot of communities that went back and forth between wet and dry. They'd vote themselves wet one year, dry the next.
Jim Drager is the Wisconsin Historical Society State Preservation Officer and co-author of Bottoms Up, a toast to Wisconsin's historic bars and breweries. He describes a national drinking culture that was out of control in the late 1800s.
People drank an awful lot more than they drink today, and so there were a lot of problems that stemmed from that. Men would go off to the factory, come home, come to the bar, cash their checks, spend all the money, come home with no money, leave their wives and children hungry in the house. There were a lot of problems with physical abuse because of alcohol.
With no social service agencies to help, the wives and mothers left to care for the families began banding together, ultimately forming the temperance movement that in 1920 helped to pass the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, Prohibition.
Bootlegging was another sinister development.
For nearly 14 years, Prohibition made it illegal to make, sell, or transport intoxicating liquor in the United States.
It had a devastating effect on taverns and breweries. Breweries and taverns closed overnight. These were significant industries that employed an awful lot of people. So there was that immediate economic impact.
For 14 years, our family basically was out of business.
The number of breweries in Wisconsin went from more than 300 to 70 during Prohibition. Many of those that survived, including Leinenkugel's, did so by making ice cream, gum, or soda pop. Taverns became ice cream parlors and soda fountains. But while Prohibition may have made alcohol illegal, it didn't make it disappear. Many of those ice cream parlors were just fronts for illegal alcohol bars called speakeasies.
Despite raids, speakeasies flourished like weeds.
If you knew the right person and you went into the soda fountain, they could sweeten your lemonade up or whatever you needed.
Drager says that's actually one of the two biggest changes to the drinking culture to come out of Prohibition, the mixed drink or cocktail. The other, women drinking in public.
They went into the speakeasies and started drinking alcohol with their husbands and boyfriends during Prohibition. So when Prohibition ended, women went into the taverns with men.
It may come as no surprise that Wisconsin led the push to end Prohibition. In 1929, voters here repealed the state's enforcement of the law. Then, Wisconsin U.S. Senator John Blaine proposed the initial amendment to repeal the national law.
Prohibition was an absolute disaster as public policy goes. It was not effective in reducing the amount of drinking. People actually drank more during Prohibition than they did before Prohibition because there was no regulation at all.
They put more hops in some of their bigger beers, so they're going to stay a little bit fresher longer.
The end of Prohibition was the beginning of a newly regulated brewing industry in America. Leinenkugel's made a name for itself as a regional beer and was successful, but stagnant. Then came the 1970s and a new level of competition in the beer industry.
So I think that the 70s was the period of time, if you look back at brewing in the United States, was the first big aha moment after Prohibition, where some of the smaller regionals like Leinenkugel's were saying, boy, I don't know if we're going to be able to stay in business and compete directly against the large brewers.
Ultimately, Leinenkugels decided not to compete and agreed to a buyout by Miller Brewing in 1988. But the unique arrangement allows a Leinenkugel to remain president and oversee operations. Jake announced his retirement in September. His brother Dick now has the job.
The phenomenon of the huge mega keg of brewery, whether it be a Miller, Coors, Anheuser-Busch, is a relatively recent phenomenon in history. You know, prior to the Industrial Revolution, all brewing was home brewing. All brewing was farm breweries.
Kirby Nelson is brewmaster and co-founder of Wisconsin Brewing Company in Verona. Before that, he helped start Capital Brewing in Middleton, one of the state's first craft or microbreweries.
In the early mid-90s, the microbreweries started to explode.
There are about 100 breweries in Wisconsin today.
We became known as a brewing center for the United States and the world at one time, and quite frankly, we're becoming one again.
And beer isn't the only brew Wisconsin has made famous. We're also the leading consumers of brandy in the U.S. Speakeasies went back to being open taverns after Prohibition, and that industry flourished. Today in Wisconsin, there are more bars than grocery stores.
I think when people talk about drinking culture, what they're talking about is the social aspect of drinking. Part of it is geography. Wisconsin is a place that's cold in the winter, so you want to have a refuge to go to in the winter. People get cabin fever. They want to be in some place where they can be social.